Café was busy. Late morning sunlight spilling across wooden tables. Customers sipped coffee, tapped on laptops and chatted quietly. At one corner, a police officer noticed a man sitting alone. He wore casual clothes, a simple black t-shirt, dark jeans, sunglasses resting on his head. The man's posture was relaxed, shoulders straight, arms folded casually. The officer smirked and leaned slightly, speaking in a joking tone. "Hey, you look like you just wandered out of a movie set," he said, chuckling under his breath. No one else paid much attention. The man didn't react immediately. He continued, sipping his coffee. Calm, almost meditative. There was no sign of offense, no sudden movement, no hint of tension. The officer nudged another customer nearby, whispering a little louder, laughing. The man's calm demeanor, his quiet composure, made the officer even more amused. A perfect target for mockery. But then something subtle shifted. The officer noticed a faint glint in his eyes, steady, measured, and quietly commanding. There was something about the way he held himself, how he scanned the room, noticing details without effort. The officer paused, realizing that maybe this wasn't an ordinary man. A strange tension crept in, a moment of uncertainty. Have you ever misjudged someone based on first impressions? How did it turn out? The man finally looked up, calm, confident, unshaken. His presence alone seemed to quiet the room. The café continued around them, but the air between them had shifted. The officer's smirk faded slightly, replaced with curiosity and cautious respect. The café buzzed softly, espresso machines hissing and milk frothing in the background. Sunlight hit the polished wood floors, casting warm reflections. The man in the corner remained calm, arms folded, eyes quietly observing. His black t-shirt and dark jeans were simple, but his posture radiated control. He didn't glance around nervously or fidget. Each small movement, a slow sip of coffee, a deliberate glance, a relaxed hand on the table, seemed measured and intentional. The officer continued, whispering jokes to nearby customers, leaning casually, his tone mocking but playful. At first, the man didn't respond. Then, subtly, his presence began to shift the energy in the room. People nearby unconsciously straightened, kept quiet, or avoided drawing attention. The officer noticed it, the silent command in the man's demeanor. No words had been spoken, no raised voice, no gestures of authority. Just confidence emanating from posture, calm eyes, and controlled breathing. A waitress paused mid-step, glancing at the man before continuing. Even the café patrons not directly involved felt it, an invisible pressure. A sense that this was no ordinary customer. The officer's smirk faltered slightly. He realized that mocking words might not be the true measure here. The man didn't need to speak or react to establish his presence. It was all in how he carried himself. At that moment, the engagement question naturally arises: do you think confidence is noticed more through words or body language? The officer straightened, subtle tension in his shoulders. He watched the man carefully, now curious, instead of amused. The room felt quieter, though nothing had changed materially. Only perception had shifted. The café scene now carried a subtle weight, as if the balance of authority had silently tipped. The café atmosphere felt normal on the surface. Low murmurs, the clinking of coffee cups, and the occasional laughter from a nearby table. But near the corner, tension had quietly begun to accumulate. The officer, still chuckling at his own jokes, leaned back in his chair. He glanced at the man in the black t-shirt, expecting a reaction, a flinch, maybe even a stammer. Nothing happened. The man continued sipping his coffee, scanning the room with calm, measured eyes, as if aware of every detail, yet entirely unbothered. Customers nearby began to notice subtle changes. A couple paused mid-conversation to glance at him. A barista hesitated, then took a step back while pouring a latte. The man's quiet presence shifted the energy without a single word. The officer felt a flicker of doubt. He had been so sure this man was an easy target for mockery. But now, the officer's own laughter faltered. There was something unusual about this calmness, something almost magnetic. The man shifted slightly, leaning forward, but still silent. He acknowledged nothing directly. Yet the officer found his own posture subtly changing, shoulders tightening, eyes now focused on the man rather than his coffee. Every small movement, a blink, a tilt of the head, a subtle breath, seemed deliberate, controlled, and deliberate. Time slowed in the officer's mind. He realized that he had misjudged someone who appeared ordinary, but carried a presence that demanded attention without drama. The café felt heavier somehow, as if everyone was unconsciously waiting for a reaction that might never come. At this moment, the question arises naturally for reflection. When someone seems ordinary but acts unusually calm, how do you usually react? The officer's smirk vanished completely. He straightened in his chair, no longer mocking, unsure whether to continue or withdraw. The man's calmness was not arrogance, not a performance. It was controlled confidence that changed the dynamics of the room. Even without words, the officer felt the subtle shift in authority. What had started as playful mockery was now replaced by careful observation, hesitation, and an unspoken respect. The tension in the café was no longer about who spoke louder, but about who commanded attention simply by being. Every observer, from customers to staff, silently acknowledged the quiet presence of someone extraordinary. The officer leaned back, a nervous chuckle escaping him. He had been confident moments ago, mocking the man's casual stance. But now, something was changing, subtly, but unmistakably. The man in the black t-shirt took a slow sip of his coffee. No rush, no exaggerated gesture. Every movement was deliberate, calm and measured. The officer's eyes narrowed. There was a sense of awareness, an unmistakable focus in the man's gaze. Not scanning nervously like most people, but observing the room with quiet precision. Every small detail, the placement of chairs, the pattern of light, the soft movements of customers, seemed registered effortlessly. A moment passed. The officer realized something. This was no ordinary man. His smirk faltered. He straightened in his chair, trying to mask his surprise, but he couldn't. A quiet, unmistakable shift had occurred. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply existed with authority. The engagement question emerges naturally at this moment. Have you ever witnessed someone instantly command respect without saying a word? The officer's own body language betrayed him. His shoulders stiffened. His hands gripped the edge of the table unconsciously. He realized that the playful mockery had ceased to matter. Around him, a few customers glanced up, sensing the subtle change in energy. Even the barista paused mid-pour, eyes flicking discreetly toward the man. The man finally set his cup down. He adjusted his posture slightly, folding his arms across his chest, and looked around. No one in the café challenged him. No one laughed, whispered, or moved hastily. The officer's mind raced. He recognized the aura immediately, commanding respect through calm confidence alone. It wasn't intimidation. It wasn't aggression. It was presence, control, awareness, all of it unspoken, but undeniable. A pause. The officer, swallowing hard, leaned back fully. The weight of realization settled over him. The man he had just mocked was Steven Seagal. The room remained quiet, almost reverent, no dramatic gestures, no shouting. Just a subtle acknowledgement that someone extraordinary had entered an ordinary café. The officer straightened, now fully aware that the lesson had been given silently. Confidence, skill, and presence do not always need words. Sometimes they speak louder than any declaration. Even the customers who had noticed glanced discreetly, some nodding imperceptibly to themselves, silently recognizing the authority that required no announcement. The moment lingered, heavy with realization, a quiet turning point where playful mockery transformed into humility, awe, and respect. The café returned to a quiet rhythm. Cups clinking, coffee machines hissing, conversations murmuring. Yet something in the air had shifted. The officer, once loud and teasing, now sat straighter, hands resting tensely on the table. Steven Seagal remained calm, unshaken. a quiet anchor in the room. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand acknowledgement, and didn't respond to the officer's previous mockery. His stillness, his composed gaze, communicated everything without a word. The officer glanced at him again, noticing subtle gestures. A slight nod, a deliberate sip of coffee, a measured shift of weight. Each movement carried intention, confidence, and authority. Nothing flashy. Nothing forced, yet the effect was undeniable. Other customers, who had only been onlookers before, now seemed to subconsciously adjust. A barista paused mid-pour, glancing subtly at the man. Even casual patrons felt a quiet sense of respect for someone who didn't need to assert dominance verbally. The officer finally exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He realized that his previous words had been meaningless. All that mattered now was presence and subtlety, how someone carried themselves in the room. At that moment the question arises naturally. Why do you think subtle gestures can sometimes communicate more than words? Seagal made no eye contact with the officer directly. He didn't lecture or scold. He simply existed in his calm state. The officer understood without a single sentence being spoken. The young barista, who had been quietly observing, now smiled slightly. She had seen respect commanded not through volume or action but through small deliberate gestures that spoke volumes about skill, confidence, and awareness. The officer, meanwhile, slowly nodded to himself. He had learned an unspoken lesson about humility, perception, and restraint. He realized that respect was earned in ways that didn't always need explanation. Around them, life in the café continued, but the tension had transformed into quiet reflection. No applause, no dramatic acknowledgments, just understanding, absorbed silently by those who had witnessed it. Even without words, the officer could feel the lesson sinking in. Presence, calm authority, and measured gestures often carry more weight than any statement or boast. Seagal returned to his coffee, untouched by the prior attention, allowing the room to settle naturally. The café scene remained ordinary to the casual observer, but those who had paid attention now carried a subtle awareness of the power of silent authority. The café slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the soft hum of conversations, the hiss of espresso machines, and the clinking of cups filling the background. Yet the air around the corner table was subtly different. The officer sat quietly, hands folded, reflecting. He replayed the moment in his mind, the mockery he had thought was harmless, and the calm, unshakable presence of the man he had targeted. He realized the lesson had come without a single word from the man. Steven Seagal continued sipping his coffee, calm, composed, completely unaffected by the attention or the tension he had created without speaking. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice. Yet the impact was undeniable. The officer's perspective shifted. He understood that strength and confidence were not always loud. Respect did not always come from authority or words. Sometimes it was subtle, quiet, and revealed only through observation. Around them, the Café patrons were unaware of the lesson that had quietly unfolded. To any casual observer, nothing remarkable had happened. But for those who had watched closely, a subtle shift had occurred, an unspoken recognition of presence, skill, and calm authority. The officer exhaled, a small, reflective smile forming. He had learned something important about misjudgment and perception. It was a moment that would stay with him far longer than any words or confrontation could. At that point, the natural reflection question arises for the audience. Have you ever misjudged someone quietly, then learned a lesson? How did it affect you? The man in the black t-shirt finally stood, adjusted his posture, and left the café without a word. The officer watched him go, silently grateful for the unexpected lesson. He knew that the encounter would linger in his mind, a quiet reminder of the power of presence, humility, and observation. The CAC returned fully to normal. Life moved on, cups were refilled, conversations resumed, but the officer now carried a subtle awareness, a shift in perception. He had witnessed firsthand how calm authority could transform an interaction without a single dramatic act. The story ends quietly, not with applause or words, but with the internal reflection of those who had observed. Some lessons, the strongest ones, are learned in silence, leaving an imprint far deeper than spectacle ever could.